Welcome to this episode of the Minute to Track podcast. Today, I have a very special guest with me, and I know you're going to love this episode. We're going to talk about strategic disappointment as a key to innovation and future-ready leadership. The guest that I bring on is Kate O'Neill. She's a widely recognized tech humanist, a prominent author, a keynote speaker, and a strategic advisor focusing on the intersection of technology and human experience. She's also the founder and CEO of KO Insight, a firm helping organizations make technology decisions that prioritize human well-being and ethical considerations. But let me get a little bit into Kate's history. Kate was among the first 100 employees at Netflix, where she established the company's first content management role. She also developed Toshiba America's inaugural intranet and founded MetaMarketer, an early digital strategy and analytics agency. Her client portfolio includes industry leaders such as Google, IBM, Adobe, and institutions like Yale University and the United Nations. It's quite a list and an impressive resume. Then in 2020, she's been shortlisted for the Thinkers 50 Digital Thinking Award and has participated in panels at the Thinkers 50 Awards Gala, discussing topics like AI's impact on human work and experience. Now, she's also the author of several influential books, including Tech Humanist, A Future So Bright, and her latest, What Matters Next, released in 2025. I am really excited to share this interview with you. I know you're going to take a lot away from it. So without further ado, let's dive right into the conversation with Kate. Here are the two questions this podcast answers. One, how do you successfully transition into your first official leadership role? And two, how do you keep climbing that leadership ladder and continuously get promoted, although the competition and the expectations get bigger? This show, the Manage to Track podcast, will provide the answers. I'm your host, Ramona Shaw. I'm on a mission to create workplaces where work is seen as a source of contribution, connection, and personal fulfillment. And this transition starts with developing a new generation of leaders who know how to lead so everyone wins and grows. In the show, you'll learn how to think, communicate, and act as a confident and competent leader you know you can be. Kate, thank you for being on the Manage to Track podcast. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you, Ramona. Glad to be here.
I already introduced you to the audience, but I'd love to hear from you. When you think about your career starting off or early on being a Netflix content strategist and setting up that department, and now to the work that you do today with really leading the conversation around AI and the human-centric approach to AI, what is it for you? What is that red thread that you, in reflection, look back and you say like, oh, okay, this was what guided me from there to here?
You know, it's really funny. In order to find that red thread, I have to go back one step farther than Netflix to the fact that I was a language major. I was a linguist in my education. And so I've always been really interested in learning languages and in the core of language. Like, why do we use language? What is language for? What are we trying to accomplish through the means of language? And I think that has been this kind of constant for me throughout my career and throughout my life. And you can find it throughout my career, you know, this kind of constant question of how do we connect with one another? How do we communicate with one another? How are we using technology and tools to better connect and communicate with one another? And I think even as you think about the manager questions throughout my career and throughout, you know, the work that I do now and helping leaders make better decisions around technology, it still has a lot to do with how we communicate with one another. You know, what are we trying to communicate? What's meaningful? What are we actually prioritizing? So it's interesting how I feel like everyone gets to find the way that they see the world, right? Like the lens they see the world through. And for me, the lens I see the world through is always language. Ramona, I want to ask you, what is your red thread? What is your lens that you look at the world through?
Yeah, I definitely have this intersection between business results and building, and on the other side, that like deep human interest. And it's funny, as I was deciding my master's degree back in the day, I signed up for human resources first, and then like pulled back out like a week into the first semester, and shifted into finance. But I can even go back then looking at and it was constantly in my head of like, how do I connect business results with like that human aspect and human
That's so cool.
behavior that I was always super interested in, even as a young child, like wanting to know how people live and why they decide what they do. And it's just like that always fascinated me. And now I get this to be my job, where I'm listening to people tell their life stories or their own internal reflections.
Yeah, so you can almost take an anthropologist view of
Mhm.
the whole thing.
Right. And
That's
all in the
so
business
interesting.
context. Yeah.
Yeah,
And every
yeah.
single job sort of ties into that. Thank you for asking the question. Now let's talk about today. I think you're at the forefront of conversations that need to happen. What is it specifically for you that motivates you and gets you up in the morning, the thing that you want to push forward?
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting that we started out with that red thread and that lens conversation because so much of the way that I see the problems that I'm trying to solve in the world and the clarity I'm trying to offer have to do with meaning and the shape that meaning takes in business is purpose. And I think we talk a lot about purpose in management work and leadership work, and purpose, I think, often starts to sound a little bit like this very vague, esoteric idea that's sort of touchy-feely and soft and fuzzy all at the same time. But everyone says it's so important. It's so important, and I think the reason why, for me, that it's so important and that what makes it seem a little more graspable to people is when you really come at that question of what lens are you looking at the world through and how are you understanding what matters to people? How are you understanding, what matters in the business that you're running and what matters to the people outside of your business? What connects those and how can you make that clearer? How can you make it stronger? How can you use technology, for example, to amplify and accelerate the value that you're adding through that connection of what matters to you and what matters to people outside of your business? That's what purpose really is, in my view, is that clarity of your meaning and
Mhm.
other people's meaning, what they're trying to accomplish. So I feel like for me, what drives me, what makes me really excited is the idea or the opportunity to bring some of that clarity to people in the work that I do and help them see the clarity of the value they're offering and of the good that they can do in the world, even as they build very successful businesses and bring
Mhm.
their work to scale.
Can you break this down into an example or just
Mhm.
demonstrate that in an example, either for a company or for a department or an individual team? Because many
Yeah,
of the listeners, well, not own, some are running companies, but some of them are just running teams. And so there is sometimes a
sure.
disconnect of like, how much agency do I actually have if I'm
Yeah.
just one section of the business? So I'm curious to hear, based on your experience working with leaders, what that could look like specifically.
Yeah, I have one favorite example is to think about, and it's because it's an easy one for many people to visualize, is Disney theme parks. Because the way that you can describe in very simple language, and the way they do describe what their purpose is, their strategic organizational purpose, is create magical experiences. And I think that's a really crystal clear one because when you think about everyone who's in any role across the organization, whether you're working in a souvenir shop on Main Street in a theme park, or whether you're answering phones in a call center trying to help people connect to their vacation and plan all the details, or you're sweeping streets. I mean, it doesn't matter if your job is to contribute how you contribute to creating magical experiences, then that crystallizes things for you. That shows you what you have the autonomy and the agency to do, assuming that management, that leadership has done the right thing and made it clear that within the sphere of your influence, you should help contribute to creating magical experiences. So I think that's one that's really vivid for people, and I think it helps to drive the point home. But then I think even on top of that, it becomes even clearer when you think about how technology layers onto that because they invested a good amount of money into those My Magic Band wearables. And the My
Mhm.
Magic Bands were all about connecting people to the data that they were going to connect through the park, all their lodging information, their payment information, their bookings and reservations at various restaurants or rides or whatever. And all of this, the preferences they had, all of those things were able to be stored in those devices, and it would open doors and open gates and magically connect them to their reservations and pay for things. And that does feel like a magical experience. Even though it's just technology, it feels like a magical experience. And yet the price tag for having done a huge transformation project like that is enormous. But when you can think about how much ROI and how aligned it is with what the business purpose is, it becomes a lot easier at a leadership level to feel good about that investment, to feel like we're making the right investment because it aligns so clearly with what we're trying to do.
So let's assume we're in a leadership meeting where we're talking about making strategic decisions. What are you seeing as an observer first, mistakes that leadership makes, and then what are sort of the key messages that you want to, whisper into the room that they should hear to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes up an awful lot with my clients and the folks that I speak with in keynotes all the time is a real tendency that I think leaders have to chase the shiny object, right? And the shiny object very often is technology,
Mhm.
or it's some new organizational structure, or it's, some new methodology or something. But often these days it is technology, and most often these days it is AI in some form or other. And so what you hear a lot, or like what I hear a lot in my work, is what's our AI strategy, or what's our, automation strategy, or what, fill in the blank here, right? But that is actually letting the tail wag the dog. That is not how strategy work is done. Strategy work is done at that more holistic level of thinking about purpose and origin stories and, value creation and how it is that you're connecting with the people outside of the organization and how you're creating those experiences. Then technology is very, very useful and relevant in helping fulfill on that strategy. So you might say, how does AI help us achieve the strategic objectives we have identified? But you don't have an AI strategy per se. And I think that conversation, that distinction, feels, I think, to some people like nitpicking, but it makes a really big difference in the way leaders frame that question. And it makes a very big difference in the prioritization and the way they approach, kind of allocation of resources and alignment of resources. And it makes a difference in the way everyone in the organization sees their role in helping fulfill the success of the mission of the company too, even if they aren't necessarily tied up in how we're rolling out this particular AI tool or something like that. If they understand the overall objective of the company and what that strategic organizational purpose is, and then they see, oh, okay, we're doing this AI initiative and it's going to help us in the procurement side of the business. It's going to help us be hopefully 10 to 20% more efficient in our procurement. That sounds to somebody who works on the other side of the business like it doesn't affect them. But actually, if you have helped communicate, here we come back to, communicating clearly, right? If you've helped communicate what it is you're hoping to accomplish at that organizational level strategically by having this procurement system bring more efficiency into that side of the business, how it's going to help the other sides of the business, how it's going to help everyone be able to be more effective in what they use and what they report and things like that. However you communicate that, it's going to help people understand how they are a part of initiatives that sound totally removed from where they are. I think another fun example of this that might be useful to share is that when I was at Netflix in those early days, I was one of the first 100 employees of Netflix. So, we didn't have a huge enterprise organization like many of your listeners may be part of. So it wasn't that difficult to stay abreast of things that were going on, but it was still important as a growing organization, a fast growing organization, to understand how my work connected to someone else's work and how theirs connected to someone else's. And so what we did, that I think is such an important lesson for much larger organizations that even this smaller company was doing, is to say we have a central goal that we're trying to achieve. And at that time we wanted to grow to 1 million customers, I believe was the number. And then everyone had in their own department, in their own group, their own metric that would contribute to the success of that top line goal. And so you can almost draw an organizational chart, not of the teams and resources, but of the KPIs, of the metrics that we were using to contribute to that top, that most important objective. And so everybody could feel, well, of course I want you to succeed in this metric that you're measuring because I can see how that contributes to the top level measurement. I'm contributing to it a completely different way. I'm coming at it from a different direction, but I want to help you and support you in how you're getting to that objective too. And it really, really helps cut across the organization in ad hoc teams and in the ability to collaborate in organic ways that are authentic because we all want the same things.
So what I'm hearing from you is there's either a tendency where we're looking at the different AI transformations and initiatives, and then we communicate them in a bit of a siloed approach. It can quickly get scattered and it can turn into a disconnect from what the purpose is and what we're actually trying to achieve, especially for people on the receiving end who don't have the big picture, who then feel sort of like pulled into different directions. Or we can constantly start with the top, the main purpose, and then communicate from here on out of how everything else supports that main purpose or the main KPI in that case. Now, when I think about a range of organizations, let's say that I'm supporting, there are some where, let's say a company that mainly does translation services, they know they're going to completely be disrupted. It isn't a question, like everything that they do, maybe even the whole purpose needs to completely be rethought. But then there are companies that are not going to be disrupted. Let's say this is an organization that does something, it's a brick and mortar, a hotel, a restaurant. And yes, sort of the automation, the technology behind the scenes can help, but they're not, it's hospitality. They're going to do what they always did. Then there's this huge range in the middle of organizations who don't know yet, will they be disrupted or in which way? And I wonder sometimes how much leaders think AI is there to change the direction of the organization at large. And that seems exciting, especially for visionaries and people who like new ideas, versus it just being a supporting function to the purpose that's already been defined.
Yeah, and I think it's a really meaningful observation and question, I think kind of rolled into one. I think what happens with AI is, as you know, I'm sure, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, AI is a very broad term for a wide range of technologies. It's an umbrella term that encompasses many different kinds of things, from all the way from, the tools that make recommendations on, Amazon when you buy something to suggest to you what else you might like to buy, to facial recognition, to, sensors that recognize when you're approaching, to obviously ChatGPT and the category of large language models, and lots and lots and lots of things more. So when we talk about AI, we are really talking about a very diverse set of functions and skills. So when I think about what you're asking there, what you're saying too, I think it's really important to acknowledge your implied understanding is correct. There are different levels of where this is relevant within the organization. It's going to matter in an organization as a whole. A leader who's leading, a CEO or the boards of directors and things like that, are going to want to think holistically about how AI is disrupting the category that they're in, the industry that they're in, and how it's going to change the entire operating model of the company. But that's just one layer. I think underneath of that layer, you have to be thinking about the ways that the company breaks down into its organizational functions and how it does what it does, and what its sort of secret sauce is. And that is obviously likely to be disrupted in various ways by different kinds of technologies, including different kinds of AI as well. And I think even when you take it to the individual level, you start thinking about, how is AI part of how I do my job, how I'm going to augment my job, how my job is going to be changing over time, and what tasks are going to be automated that I used to do, and it used to be really important that I do, but now it's not that important that I do that task anymore. I think that's part of what is so complicated about the future of work as a conversational topic, that we often conflate the future of work with the future of jobs and the future of industries and the future of workplaces and so on. You get the idea. Like there's a lot of different concepts that can be disambiguated and talked about separately, but often we talk about them as if they're the same thing. And so I think it really helps for listeners thinking about this within their organizations and having this conversation within their organizations. Really push yourself and your colleagues to break that down a little further and make sure you're talking about the same level of disruption. Are you talking about as an organization, or are you talking about individually? And are you talking about like what category of technology are we really anticipating might challenge us as an industry? Because certainly there are still going to be ways for a translation agency, for example, to offer a kind of value that is unique to the moment, right? To be able to offer accuracy and human nuance and cultural sensitivity and context sensitivity and all the things that we know that automated translation isn't necessarily all that good at yet. And we would want to rely on human translators for the kinds of things that are going to be extra sensitive when it's healthcare related, government related, like anything where there's a very, very critical context for getting it right and getting the nuance right. And you could extend that across to different types of organizations, different types of industries, just the same. I think everybody has their own questions and considerations of where they bring a unique value that so far AI has not pushed aside. And they need to think about that at every level of the organization.
What I'm taking from this in the aspect of what can leaders do with this? I'm hearing you say, let's say, if a leader says, oh, you have an offsite, we want to talk about AI, we're going to spend 2-3 hours with the team, 15 people in the room, talking about AI and the impact on us as a team. In that conversation, I'm hearing you say is, get really clear on what level are you talking about? Like, what's the level of AI influence? Are you talking about sort of broader what the team does and the team's purpose, or is the purpose very clear? Then start with that, talk about the main purpose, the main KPIs, and then look at the workflows and the tasks and the tools of the technology currently in use to look at how to optimize it to then get to that outcome, the KPI or higher KPI.
Yeah, because I think there's every leader, every manager, every professional right now wants to know how they should be using AI, and they're figuring out day by day how to use AI and other technologies to advance their own productivity and effectiveness and sort of shore up their own value contribution into the organization and into the industry. That's just clear across the board. I have consultative sessions on a regular basis with clients whose executive teams want guidance on how they can better use AI tools for their own effectiveness and their own sort of leadership communications and things like that. That's cool, that's fine, but that's not the same as considering how do we as an organization think ahead, a few years, 10 years, 20 years? How do we think about what the next likely steps in our industry are likely to be, as well as adjacent to our industry? What are some of the intersecting pressures and opportunities where you might see movement on that sector that's adjacent to where we are? And maybe there's opportunity for us to distinguish ourselves as an agency that understands that sector, or we pick up a little slack, or we step away from that sector and we move over here. Those kinds of considerations, that future readiness is incredibly important for leaders to think about and to talk about and to plan. That's work that I do with my clients. But I think it's a conversation that leaders can have amongst themselves very effectively too. I think it just requires that they understand that they're asking questions at different levels of abstractions, different levels of time period, right? Like, so are we talking about what we're doing now, what we're going to decide today about this, or are we talking about what we think we'd like to set ourselves up to decide over the coming 12 months to 18 months, and then kind of longer term, where we see making trial investments into how we might bring more automation into these procurement workflows or into our customer support function or that sort of thing. But what I don't want to see, what I too often see, is managers and leaders jumping the gun and saying, great, we've got ChatGPT, we can get rid of our customer support function now. That
Right.
is, or, whole newsrooms being replaced by ChatGPT. And it's way too rash. And you see a lot of these decisions where the leaders backpedal on them shortly thereafter, right? You see this happen again and again. So I think what we do is we take a much more both and kind of approach to it. We want to have a foot in that water. We definitely want to, be sticking our toe in and figuring out what makes sense for us, where the value is, how we want to build, what direction we want to go. And we want to be sure we're being clear and communicative with our teams about how we value them, how we value their contribution to the team, and how we want them to help us figure out the future with us. And that sets up an environment where people aren't scared that they're going to be replaced by technology.
Mm-hmm.
They're more curious about, yeah, you present an interesting challenge, because if our value is this and what we're trying to do is that, then AI could really help us do more of this with more of a team involved. And so it becomes much more of a group problem solving exercise.
And I can imagine that also supports the upskilling, reskilling, and sort of people's adaptability to the change
Yeah,
when you have these type of conversations.
absolutely. People
And
become curious about what skills they can add to their own repertoire, as opposed to having a defensive posture and going like, mine, all mine. Like, I don't want to let go of
right.
any of these responsibilities and let
Mm-hmm.
AI take that over, even for tasks that AI is perfectly capable of taking over at this point in time.
Oh, that could get us down into a whole other conversation. Very interesting one, because I know how much the ego plays into what we do or don't do. And I'm sure there's some, understandable concerns over people's safety around their job that influence those decisions as well. But I'd like
Yeah.
to talk a little bit more about the point that you make around strategic disappointment.
Mm.
Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, so it's funny. I just wrote an article for Fast Company about strategic disappointment. And it's a funny term. I think people come at it like a little bit sideways, like, what? What are you talking about? But I think of it partly in contrast to this other term that I use in my work, which is strategic optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And strategic optimism, I'll start with that first, because I think it's really important to recognize that strategic optimism is a way of thinking about the future that is neither perfectly optimistic nor perfectly pessimistic. It's not just about dystopia versus utopia. It's a way of saying, look, we know that there are risks and harms with whatever we're looking at, whatever decision we're looking at, like rolling out AI in a customer support function, for example. And we also know that there are opportunities. So how do we lean into the opportunities while mitigating the harms? How do we embrace the best possible futures that we want to create and create some safety and security around what the risks are? And similarly, what I think strategic disappointment is the opportunity to say, in order to do new things, in order to bring about new things into the world, people who are not going to be excited about that change, who are thinking, I liked it the way it was, are going to be disappointed. And you need to get into the habit of questioning whether the change that you're bringing about is truly in line with that top level strategy that we've talked about multiple times throughout this discussion. And if it is, then you have to believe in it enough to be able to disappoint people.
Mm-hmm.
And I offer a grid in the Fast Company article. People can find it on fastcompany.com, looking up strategic disappointment. And I offer a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, that breaks down the way that you can think about certainty versus disappointment in the decisions that you're considering. Like if you have a decision that you need to make and the certainty is high and the disappointment is low, well, by all means, lean into that, do that
Mm-hmm.
enthusiastically. Just know that that is not likely to bring a whole lot of innovation with it.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you have a change that you think needs to be made and your certainty is fairly low, but your disappointment is fairly high, a lot of times what those are situations where you think there's a transformative potential, some kind of true innovation potential, somewhere you can pivot the company into a whole new area, but you have to do it very carefully. And you have to make sure that you're messaging that within the company carefully too, so that people don't begin to think that you're chasing something that is totally irrelevant to what they've understood the mission of the company to be. So you have to make sure that people can see the trajectory that you see, the opportunity you see. And there's different communication challenges for each of these scenarios. But there are examples that I share as well, like Apple deciding to get rid of headphone jacks. And that was something that tech journalists and the general public were very critical of at the time. People called it they called it user hostile. They said it was stupid. And now, we've got these, and
Mm-hmm.
no one can even remember. People are so comfortable with, AirPods and Bluetooth headsets that you see people with headphones every so often, but it's just not, or, the wired headphones. It's sort of a Gen Z trend, I guess. But you also recognize that most people can say like, oh, that turned out to be a pretty good decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the confidence of recognizing why you're making that decision, what it ultimately is leading you to, and the future that you're freeing up in that strategic optimism sort of way, the future you're freeing up in order to pursue it. And if you have that clarity of the vision, you can withstand the disappointment that you're creating. But you just have to make sure that you're
Mm-hmm.
creating that disappointment intentionally and purposefully, and not in a way that's hostile or harmful to people, because that means that you haven't communicated it clearly enough. You haven't shown what the vision that you have for the future is. You're not casting a clear enough vision. Oftentimes that's where leaders fall down, is that they will talk about the benefit of making this change now, but they won't cast a clear enough vision about where we're trying to go as a result of making this change.
As you're talking about this, it's becoming like really clear to me that when you talk about strategic disappointment, and I see this in my own decisions too, really taking the disappointment factor into consideration, almost as if that was part of the strategy, so that I don't see it as, oh, it's a negative side effect or byproduct of it.
Right.
But if I put that into the matrix that you just explained, I then can actually see what kind of transformation we're going to go about based on the enemies I create or the
Yeah.
disappointment that will ensue
Yeah,
that
it
decision.
all connects
Mhm.
to, in my book, which I know we briefly talked about, What
Yep.
Matters
Thanks for holding
Next.
up.
There,
Mhm.
one of the models that I introduce is called the Now Next Continuum. And along that continuum, this is a way of visualizing the timeline of past to present to future in ways that hopefully offer a sense of it being less daunting to think about the future, because people, I think, often feel like the future is too uncertain for the rapid acceleration with which we're moving toward it. It feels like things are changing so fast, and we're going toward what feels very uncertain. But there are actually ways that we can put our arms around it much more, and get some clarity about what we're dealing with. And so these are some of the models that I lay out in the book. One of them is the clarity that, to your point, we often talk about digital transformation or just transformation and innovation as if those are interchangeable terms, but they are not. They are actually in two different places on the now next continuum. The transformation happens in the sense of bringing the past to the present. It's
Mhm.
catching up to the current moment. It's catching up to customer expectations, or to where the market has moved, what your competitors are doing, and that sort of thing. That's all where transformation efforts focus. Innovation, on the other hand, is present to future. It's saying, here we stand, we're looking ahead, we're trying to think about what green space we could create, what green fields we could open that nobody's in, that we could totally do something new and revolutionary and create a whole new opportunity. And at any given time, companies should be heavily invested in both of those activities, because every company needs to catch up on something, and every company should be looking ahead on something else. And that's the balance that I think what we see here is that as you so astutely observed, that disappointment is part of the strategy, because it is trying to figure out, what can we do to catch up with the moment? What can we do to get ahead of the moment? And how are we going to manage the change that we need to manage? How are we going to manage the behavioral resistance to change, the messaging of this to the public, the bringing the team along, making sure that they're on board with the changes that we need to make? And that's all part of the human centricity of managing through transformation and innovation. And that's why that's such an important part of using these tools like strategic optimism and strategic disappointment.
When you think about the next 3 to 5 years, so this is a bit of a question to wrap us up. What would you like to see? What would make the next 3 to 5 years really successful, not just for you and your own work, but as you observe the evolution and the developments that you see in the market?
Oh, what a great question. It's such a wonderful opportunity to think big and broad, and I love doing that. I think for me, I loved that, we started out talking about, I talked about how language is such an important part of my lens and my thinking. And obviously, once ChatGPT came on the market in November 2022 with as a large language model and all the tools that came alongside it, everybody started to understand, oh yeah, language, that's a really important way to interact with technology. But I think we have missed one really important detail, which is it isn't just language as a tool itself, it's the meaning that we wrap up in language that's really important. And meaning actually takes other forms too, in terms of the intentionality of the design that we use when we're creating experiences, in terms of the context we allow to be part of the decisions that we make. If we're creating patient experiences, for example, in a hospital or healthcare setting, it's really important that we're thinking with empathy about how scared someone might be, about how much pain they might be in, and that we design experiences with compassion for that kind of thing. So what I think is that as we see models like AI models move from just this language interaction sort of paradigm to things that are going to be more multi-sensory. We're going to see a lot more integration with gesture, which we've seen some of, but maybe not as much of as we're likely to. We're going to see other senses come into play. And we're going to see more ambient use of technologies like we see with smart speakers in homes and offices, but more of that. And I think it's really important that we use the opportunity to think in a meaningful way about how to use these multisensory environments, how to create the next round of technology, the next round of business opportunities in ways that really do fulfill as much of that meaning potential for people as possible. And really thinking about what, as a company, what meaning you're trying to convey and what meaningful experiences you're trying to have with the people who do business with you, and how can you amplify that meaning? How can you really lean into creating more meaningful experiences, whether it's with technology or with good old-fashioned conversations or whatever that might happen to look like. And so I hope that's what we start to see, is the opportunity to use the great advancement and sophistication of technologies to go to a very core place with what we're doing and the design of experiences that we're creating around meaning, and really making the most of that.
Thank you for sharing that. I think with all the sort of noise that we see around all of this, when we look what already has been built and already, died out, I think if that component of the meaning and the purpose and that human aspect isn't considered, it's unlikely to be sustainable, at least based on what we've seen over the last few years unfold, that trajectory, I assume, will continue that way. So you said that, you articulated that so well. Thank you for allowing us, or creating that space in this conversation to think a little bit bigger and beyond just the how can I make my work more efficient and more effective, or how can I help my team try to figure things out, but really having that top-down approach and really anchoring it around that meaning.
Well, thank you for allowing
Appreciate it.
that opening to happen.
Thank you, Kate, for being on the Minute to Track podcast. We will link in the show notes both to your book as well as your website, obviously, and that Fast Company article that you mentioned earlier, too, so people can read up on strategic disappointment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ramona.
Thank you, Kate.
If you enjoyed this episode, then check out 2 other awesome resources to help you become a leader people love to work with. This includes a free masterclass on how to successfully lead as a new manager. Check it out at arcova.org/masterclass. The second resource is my best-selling book, The Confident and Competent New Manager: How to Quickly Rise to Success in Your First Leadership Role. Check it out at arcova.org/books or head on over to Amazon and grab your copy there. You can find all those links in the show notes down below.